Fat of the Land by Wilhelmir Stephenson, Chapter 10. The First Pemmican War. We oversimplify when we say that the war between the states was fought over slavery. It remains true that slavery was an important issue, though perhaps not the main one. We oversimplify, too, when we follow the historians and speak of the bloody 7-year feud of 1814 to 1821 between the Northwest Company and the Hudson's Bay Company as the Pemmican War. More broadly, it was a struggle between a legally entrenched London corporation, which gained access to North America's fur territories through Hudson Bay, and a Montreal corporation, or group of affiliated traders, who secured their wares from Europe through the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Some consider that the Northwest Company, founded with Yankee participation at Montreal in the winter of 1783 to 84, was the first true organization of big business along modern lines, at least the first in North America, and that what followed was a competition between this new kind of force and an old-fashioned chartered company that was, to an extent, an agency or extension of the British government. For the Hudson's Bay Company had many non-commercial rights, including, under certain conditions, the power of life and death. The company was not supposed to hang a man just because he was competing with it, but the belief is general that some who were punished, after due trial, suffered, not so much for the crime with which they were technically charged, as for having interfered with the trading privileges of the company. At the instance of a group of nobility and merchants, under the formal leadership of his nephew Prince Rupert, King Charles II in 1670 had granted a charter to, quote, the Governor and Company of Adventurers in England trading into Hudson's Bay, end quote. This document gave to the company, quote, the sole trade and commerce of all these seas, straits, bays, rivers, lakes, creeks, and sounds, in whatsoever latitude they shall be, that lie within the entrance of the straits, commonly called Hudson's Straits, together with all the lands and territories upon the countries, coasts, and confines of the seas, bays, lakes, rivers, creeks, and sounds aforesaid, that the said land be from henceforth reckoned and reputed as one of our plantations or colonies in America, called Rupert's Land. End quote. The company's domain, Rupert's Land, was never exactly defined, or, rather, it was defined frequently and in a number of different ways. A minimum description is that the charter gave rights in the territory that drained into Hudson Bay. This would include much of what are now Quebec and Ontario, and westward nearly south to Lake Superior, with a projection into what is now the United States to cover the Minnesota-Dakota part of the Red River drainage, and then the valleys of the Saskatchewan-Nelson system to the Rocky Mountains, and of the Churchill and Thalon rivers, draining most of northeastern Canada. The company's territory was, in fact, much larger than this, for it had posts as far southwest as California, and as far northwest as the center of Alaska. It took in the valley of the Mackenzie and eventually all of northern Canada, including many of the Canadian islands. However, some of this northern expansion took place after the company had retreated from the extreme southwest and northwest, from California and Alaska. It did not finally surrender its powers as a quasi-government to the Dominion of Canada until 1869. In addition to its legal position, the Hudson's Bay Company had the fundamental advantage over the Northwest Company that the routes to the fur country from Britain and France were shorter and cheaper through Hudson Bay than through the St. Lawrence and the Great Lakes. This advantage did not apply to certain small sections, such as the immediate basin of the St. Lawrence, but it applied in most of the inland reaches where the rivals traded, even to where now are Winnipeg in Manitoba and Fargo in North Dakota. But the Great Company, as it was called, or more often the Company, had the weakness of its strength. For 100 years there was practically no competition, and the company grew flabby as it grew fat. Its agents just established posts at the places most accessible from Europe and waited for the Indians to come to them. In those days, and indeed for long after, the Indians could not grasp the European idea that time has value. It did not seem to them any particular hardship to spend weeks or months in coming 100, and in some cases nearly or quite 1,000 miles to trade for what were at first novelties, which later became necessities. Prosperous and lethargic with easy gains, the company did not even take real pains to carry out the most important obligation of its charter, its promise to the Crown that a search would be made for a practicable seaway around the north of America which would furnish Britain a short route to the Indies, the Northwest Passage. Indeed, the feeling seems to have developed early within the company management that to find the passage would be to their disadvantage, for, if successful, the route would bring in colonists. Those in charge were traders who saw themselves as mere dealers in fur. Indeed, it was not until within the time of men now living that the company realized what a series of opportunities it had lost by not coming in on the ground floor on a lot of other developments that were inevitably replacing the fur trade. What it actually did for more than 2 centuries was to fight nearly every movement toward agriculture and similar progress, on the correct but limited view that farmers destroy the fur-bearing animals. The one apparent exception to this rule of opposition to farmers is connected with the series of events that brought to a head the Pemmican War, Lord Selkirk's establishment of an agricultural colony near the present Winnipeg. The real motive here, except perhaps for Lord Selkirk's own attitude when he succeeded in getting control, was that the company was trying to thwart its rivals, the Northwesters. In the century that was practically without competition, 1670 to 1770, the Hudson's Bay Company learned a good deal about the interior, although in the main it waited at its seaport trading stations for the Indian customers to straggle in. The company did send Henry Kelsey west, or rather permitted him to join the Indians and wander out westward to where he saw the prairies and was first in Canada to report the buffalo. That was in 1690. In 1754, Anthony Henday, also called Hendry, reached the Saskatchewan and visited the Blackfoot Indians near the Rockies. Around 1770, Hearne wandered off from the Hudson Bay with the Indians, somewhat as others had done, but northwest rather than southwest, and got to some point on the Coppermine River. It is a bit more than doubtful that he reached Coronation Gulf, which he claims to describe as an eyewitness, but does describe more as if from hearsay. Still, he was the first white man to reach the vicinity of the Polar Sea by an inland journey through North America. These observations are leading up to the Pemmican War, and that struggle is to be considered mainly from the Pemmican side, so the westward and northward progress of discovery and of the fur trade is here barely sketched, avoiding most of the other grave issues and considering in detail only the food situation. The company's servants, as their employees were called, came mainly from Scotland and the Orkneys. In spite of their numerous good qualities, they were conservative, especially about diet, so that during the first 100 years they appear to have learned comparatively little about native foods. As if they had still been in Scotland, they lived in the main on porridge and bread, on salted fish and salted red meats. The fish might be locally caught, and some of the meat was of local origin, but they imported along with their cereals a good deal of European salted pork, beef, and other preserved meats, as well as some European fish. Like many other parts of the world in those days, Hudson Bay had a good deal of trouble with scurvy, nor do they seem to have held in the early years a belief that was prevalent among the company's servants after 1800, that scurvy could be prevented and cured by fresh or dried local meat. Clearly the medical theories of the company during its first century in America were like those of Europe, that scurvy was caused by such things as poor ventilation, idleness, and lack of entertainment. There was a heavy moral side to the reasoning, the conviction that a man who was ill-tempered, lazy, and without initiative would develop scurvy in consequence. As I have said elsewhere, this is putting the cart before the horse. They observed mental symptoms which were in reality the effect of scurvy, and mistook them for the cause. Then, of course, they believed that salted meats were conducive to scurvy, for this view seems to have been universal in Europe and in the American colonies during the period. It was an omen, though without revealed meaning for 100 years, that the men who really started the Hudson's Bay Company were two French Canadians from the St. Lawrence region, Pierre Radisson and Medard Chouart, who sold the idea to Prince Rupert and his associates. For the competition which was destined to worry the great company so much, and which indeed became eventually a life-and-death struggle, originated from the St. Lawrence. The French in North America were nearly everywhere more adaptable than the British, at least to the extent that they more readily adopted native ways. That makes travel easy, as had indeed been shown by Kelsey, Henday, and Hearne, who simply joined up with groups of natives and tagged along after them, traveling without equipment, expense, hardship, or danger. This adaptability tended to be exceptional with the British and to be the rule with the French. In the 1730s, Pierre Varennes traveled from Montreal with a small party, living by their own hunting or by the hunting of people whom they visited. They got as far as the Missouri River, where now are the Dakotas. This and similar journeys were, or might have been, warnings to the gentlemen adventurers of London that one day they were going to have some real competition from Montreal. It did develop, slowly at first, in part through the French Canadians and in part through British colonials, Canadians as well as Yankees, who adopted native ways to a large extent and so traveled fast and far, or at least cheaply and far. In the decades following the successful revolt of the 13 colonies along the Atlantic seaboard, free traders, as competitors of the Hudson's Bay Company were called, were pushing aggressively west beyond Lake Superior and northwest across what are now the prairie provinces of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. Indeed, the Revolutionary War still was far from over when a Connecticut Yankee, Peter Pond, established the first trading post in the Athabasca region, for that was in 1778. The valleys of the Athabasca and Peace, tributaries of the Mackenzie, became commercial tributaries to the merchants on the St. Lawrence. Instead of making long journeys to Hudson Bay, the Athabasca and Peace River Indians now traded with merchants who brought European wares almost to the doors of the teepees. The Hudson's Bay Company were not exactly caught napping, but the Northwesters frequently beat them to the draw. For instance, when the company sent Samuel Hearne in 1774 to build Cumberland House on the Saskatchewan, near the present western boundary of Manitoba, they found that the Northwest Company had a post there already. Toward 1800, the competition had grown really severe. It had been gentlemanly at first, but was increasingly turning cutthroat, as the Hudson's Bay Company felt itself slipping. The shares of the corporation, long a prized investment of Londoners, now went down and down. The dividends of the great company dropped in 1801 from 8 to 4%, and continued so until 1808, when they ceased entirely, from 1809 to 1814. This is plausibly blamed by some on the Napoleonic Wars, in which the United States took part against Britain through what we call the War of 1812. Others maintain that the inroads of the Northwest Company were largely responsible for the decrease and then the cessation of dividends. In the period between 1720 and 1820, the number of company shareholders varied from 50 to 109. These holdings were not widespread, accordingly. But a drop in income, and the struggle with the Northwesters, still made a profound impression in Britain, for the shareholders were, generally speaking, the leading families, commercially, socially, and politically. There were, on the side of the company, two main advantages in the competition with the Northwesters: that they had a superior legal position, and that it was, or should have been, cheaper per pound for them to bring in trade goods to the northern plains and to the upper Mackenzie Basin. Their mileage from the Hudson Bay was far less than that of the Northwesters from the St. Lawrence, and their transport routes were, on the whole, easier. The company's great weaknesses were that it was not adaptable and that it was not enterprising. A partial cause of both troubles was that the company was governed from across the Atlantic by a stodgy lot of financiers and nobility who had only the vaguest notion about the real problems, and who, to some extent, did not even want to understand the difficulties, feeling that the good old English way had succeeded in the past and would succeed again. Lethargy in North America derived from a weakness in London. But there was the important further reason that the company's servants were underpaid and did not have a profit-sharing arrangement with their employers. The traders of the Northwest Company were many of them partners rather than employees. In any case, they had a great deal of freedom, each being permitted to develop his own opportunities in his own district pretty much as he saw fit. Then, in so far as they were governed from a distance, it was only from Montreal, and it was chiefly by older men who had themselves in their youth traded for furs in the valleys of the Red, the Saskatchewan, and the Athabasca rivers. And it was chiefly by older men who had themselves in their youth traded for furs in the valleys of the Red, the Saskatchewan, the Athabasca, and the Peace rivers. They understood conditions, they knew the ropes. The historians seem to agree that where the relative adaptability of the rival trading organizations counted the most was in methods of transportation and in provisioning. Transportation called for exploration, the discovery of the best canoe routes and portage routes, in which the Northwesters excelled. Indeed, most of the great figures in the exploration of the period are men who, either at the time or thereafter, were affiliated with the Northwest Company. The mentioned Yankee explorers, chief of them Peter Pond, and the two Alexander Henrys, and men of old country British stock like David Thompson, Alexander Mackenzie, and the several Frobishers. Mackenzie was the first to descend the river named after him to the Polar Sea, and the first in Canada to cross the continent from east to west, which he did by way of the Peace and Fraser rivers. Scarcely less important were the journeys of Thompson, for their physical extent is equaled by the literary and historical importance of the diaries he kept, and by the cartographic values of the maps he made, including that of the Columbia River in our states of Oregon and Washington, which he was the first to descend. The Encyclopedia of Canada, for instance, says of Thompson that, quote, when he left the western country in 1812, he prepared a map of it which has been the basis of all subsequent maps. End quote. The greatest single element working for the success of the Northwesters was that they adopted native foods. Unlike most of Hudson's Bay Company men who felt that they need to have bread and porridge along with their meat, the Northwesters, if there was anything to be gained by it, lived exclusively by their own hunting or that of their companions. And in so far as the Hudson's Bay Company used native foods, it tended to prepare them in the European way, which meant that instead of wind-drying the meats, the men salted them. With the added weight of the salt, the watery meat was several times heavier and considerably more bulky than the dried provisions of the Northwesters, whose men used jerky in camp and on short trips, pemmican on the long journeys. Besides, as experience showed, and as is discussed at length hereafter, men sickened with scurvy on European-style corned beef, but kept their health and strength on the local jerky and pemmican. It was a standard calculation of the fur trade that 1 pound of jerky had the food value of 6 pounds of lean meat, and they knew from experience that in order to remain healthy and strong indefinitely, they needed a pound of suet to go with each 6 pounds of fresh lean, meaning they would have to have a pound of suet for each pound of jerky. It was considered that a man who worked hard needed per day a ration of 6 or 7 pounds of fresh lean and a pound of fat. Now pemmican is by weight half dried lean and half rendered fat, so the maximum daily pemmican ration was 2 pounds. Some of the best authorities, among them Thompson, say the outside quantity was 1.5 pounds. This was for men who slaved at the hardest labor 14 and 16 hours per day, as when tracking canoes up swift rivers, and carrying them and their loads on their shoulders across portages. We find nowadays that when a man eats nothing but pemmican, he requires only about 3/4 pound per day, if he is around town and somewhat the routine of the average business man, which means that he could do a good deal of muscular work on 1 pound. It is hard, therefore, to see how the voyagers managed to get away with 2 pounds, but there seems evidence that some of them did. Then again, eating was their chief enjoyment on the long journeys. They were mighty trenchermen, and proud of it. By 1810 it was generally recognized that the Northwest were decidedly getting the best of the contest with the Hudson's Bay Company. This was in the main through a superior transport. They had developed the best routes, the best travelers, and the best travel methods. Their food, pemmican, was so much more compact and so much lighter that they could make considerably longer journeys, or carry bigger payloads on trips of equal length. It is the payloads that bring in the pay, the wages of employees, and the profits of the stockholders or partners. The partners of the Northwest Company were getting rich. The stockholders of the Hudson's Bay Company were on reduced income. By the first decade of the 19th century, the manufacture of pemmican had become big business. The pemmican capital of the fur trade was the usual characterization of Pembina, on the Red River, where now is the northeast corner of the state of North Dakota. The Dictionary of American History says, through a section written by O.G. Libby, professor of history in the University of that state, quote, Pembina was a strategic fur trade point for the Northwest Company in its war with the Hudson's Bay Company, and Alexander Henry, Jr., in 1801, successfully occupied the post for that company. It was also one of the best-known outfitting points for the buffalo hunters of the prairies to the west and south. Their Red River carts and ponies returned with loads of pemmican, robes, skins, and dried meat. The pemmican was usually sold in Fort Carey or Winnipeg. End quote. Now enters upon the stage Thomas Douglas, 5th Earl of Selkirk, for whom it was something between a career and a passion to settle Scottish Highlanders where they would be less crowded than at home. In 1803 he planted a colony of them in Prince Edward Island. Then he went about purchasing shares of the Hudson's Bay Company. Some say merely to get control. Others say to get a control which he could use to make the company give him, in his private capacity, a concession of some fertile acres from their domain as masters of Rupert's Land. By 1811 he was in control, and got from the company a concession of 45 million of such fertile acres in the Red River Valley of what is now North Dakota, Minnesota, and Manitoba. Some think this was a move on the part of the Hudson's Bay Company itself to plant an agricultural settlement in the heart of the Pemmican country, with a view to getting the farmers to destroy the buffalo, which they would do to keep these wild animals out of the grain fields, and also to prevent their meat from competing with domestic beef and mutton. Whatever the truth, the fur men on the ground, whether Hudson's Bay Company or Northwestern, took the move as an attempt to ruin the Northwest Company by depriving it of pemmican. That meaning was implemented through an order issued by Miles McDonnell, governor of the Red River settlement, on January 8, 1814, forbidding export from the colony of pemmican and other dried provisions, meaning jerky and pounded meat. This move, if successful, would cripple the Northwesters, whose transportation system was based upon the use of light and compact provisions, and who could not get these in sufficient quantity except in the prairies of what is now northern Dakota and southern Manitoba. True, there were buffalo elsewhere, and pemmican was made and sold throughout the buffalo country. But pemmican was now a big business. Hundreds of thousands of pounds a year were required, and a single 1,000-pound buffalo would produce only 100 pounds. Great operations, such as those of the Northwesters, could not be maintained full-scale except on the basis of a continued main supply from the Red River Valley to supplement local production at the various posts that now dotted the country, from Minnesota to the Rockies and north to the Peace and Athabasca rivers. The contemporary authorities do not disagree, but it is nevertheless hard for most of us to grasp, realistically, the dependence on pemmican of the vast operations of the two great companies. The position, therefore, may be strengthened by quoting what can fairly be styled the official history of the Hudson's Bay Company, written by a member of the staff of the Canadian Head Office, Douglas Mackay, and published in 1936, entitled The Honorable Company. In his account leading up to the Pemmican War, Mackay makes the usual point that the business rivalry of the companies hinged on transportation, the question of bringing in the largest payloads of trade goods and taking out the largest payloads of furs over routes thousands of miles in length that involved ascending and descending swift and rapids-infested streams, with long and difficult portages from one river to another, through connecting swamps and over dividing ridges. It was material advantage of the Northwesters that they had been in advance of the honorable company in discarding European foods, and European methods of food preparation, for the native foods and ways. In this the adoption of pemmican was chief. On page 138, Mackay says that in 1814 Macdonell, quote, asserted his authority by issuing a proclamation forbidding the export of pemmican from Selkirk's territory of Assiniboia. Pemmican was the concentrated staple food of the fur trade, and Assiniboia was the richest pasturing ground of the buffalo. From these plains the half-breeds hunted for both companies, and the food supply of the entire fur trade had become dependent upon the area. End quote. So, practically speaking, the Northwesters had to fight with guns or yield. They chose to fight. It is agreed by the historians that both trading companies thought they had to have pemmican for true success, or at least for the easier success, of their transportation systems, as well as for stores to keep the Indians alive through seasons of scarcity. It has not been as widely recognized by the scholars, although clear from the documents, that one of the chief reasons for the supposed necessity of having enough pemmican was an opinion common by 1810 to both rivals that, in addition to being more nourishing for its weight and bulk than European foods, pemmican would also keep a man in better health, and, in particular, would save him from or cure him of scurvy. This is discussed hereafter. Expressly, and by implication, the relation of the fur trade to pemmican at this stage is well slated by two of the chief figures of the northwestern fur lands, Mackenzie and Thompson. In 1801, Mackenzie published at London his Voyages from Montreal on the river St. Lawrence through the continent of North America to the frozen and Pacific Oceans in the years 1789 and 1793, with a preliminary account of the rise, progress, and present state of the fur trade of that country. That's a long title. In his account of the trade, Mackenzie says, quote, the lean parts of the flesh of the larger animals are cut in thin slices, and are placed on a wooden grate over a slow fire, or exposed to the sun, and sometimes to the frost. These operations dry it, and in that state it is pounded between two stones. It will then keep with care for several years. If, however, it is kept in large quantities, it is disposed to ferment in the spring of the year, when it must be exposed to the air, or it will soon decay. What Mackenzie has thus far described is the pounded meat that readily absorbs moisture to which it is exposed. He now describes pemmican. Quote, the inside fat, and that of the rump, which is much thicker in these wild than our domestic animals, is melted down and mixed in a boiling state with the pounded meat in equal proportions. It is then put in baskets or bags for the convenience of carrying it. Thus it becomes a nutritious food, and is eaten without any further preparation or the addition of spice, salt, or any vegetable or farinaceous substance. A little time reconciles it to the palate. There is another sort made with the addition of marrow and dried berries, which is of a superior quality. End quote. And in case you don't know what farinaceous means, it's just a fancy word for starchy, apparently. Thus we have from Mackenzie, in 1801, a beginning of the debate as to whether it is better to use the plain article, the pemmican of lean and fat only, or to flavor with berries. This is part of a world-wide and ages-long debate between those who like their food with a natural taste and those who like it seasoned. It is essentially the debate on which is better, cake or bread, an argument that is not wholly a matter of personality, but is, at least in part, dependent on whether you are thinking of an occasional food or of a steady diet. Thompson's experience in the country was even more extensive than that of Mackenzie, and differed from Mackenzie's, who was always in command, and who, as expected with officers and gentlemen in his day, was favored on journeys through doing the least work and having the best of everything. Thompson, although sometimes in command, was less the commander who orders things done for him, and more the worker and provider, hunter and fisher, as well as leader. In 1810, 4 years before the start of the Pemmican War, Thompson was on the North Saskatchewan River, where stood Fort Augustus, which, until 11 years before, had been the most westerly trading post of the Hudson's Bay Company, near what is now the boundary between the provinces of Saskatchewan and Manitoba. It was already more than 25 years since he left his native Scotland, and he was a man who had worked his way upward in frontier trade and travel. He gives in his diary entry for June 22, 1810, at once a picture of the staple food of the long-distance traveler and of the role it played in the fur industry. I quote from pages 134 to 135 of David Thompson's narrative, Champlain Society, Toronto, 1916. Quote, "On the west side of these alluvials is Cumberland Lake, on the east bank of which is situated Cumberland House, in latitude 53 degrees 56 minutes 45 seconds north, longitude 102 degrees north 13 minutes west. This house was the first inland trading post the Hudson's Bay Company made, remarkably well situated for the trade of the fine furs. It serves as the general depot for all the dried provisions made of the meat and fat of the bison under the name of pemmican, a wholesome, tasteful, nutritious food, upon which all persons engaged in the fur trade mostly depend for their subsistence during the open season." Thompson now describes the pemmican he is talking about, raising some points that are new to this discussion. Quote, "It is made of the lean and fleshy parts of the bison, dried, smoked, and pounded fine. In this state it is called bear meat. The fat of the bison is of two qualities, called hard and soft. The former is from the inside of the animal, which, when melted, is called hard fat. The latter is made from the large deposits of fat that lie on each side of the backbone, covering the ribs, and which is readily separated, and when carefully melted resembles butter in softness and sweetness. Pemmican is made up in bags of 90 pounds weight, made of bison leather with the hair on. The proportion of the pemmican, when best made for keeping, is 20 pounds of soft and the same of hard fat, slowly melted together and at a low warmth, poured on 50 pounds of the bear meat, well mixed together and closely packed in a bag of about 30 inches in length by near 20 inches in breadth and about 4 inches in thickness, which makes them flat, the best shape for stowage and carriage. I have dwelt on the above, as it is the staple food of all persons, and affords the most nourishment in the least space and weight. Even the gluttonous French Canadian that devours 8 pounds of fresh meat every day is contented with 1½ pounds per day. It would be admirable provision for the Army and Navy." End quote. Except for Thompson's implying that it is wholesome in a general way, I do not find in his extensive writings the view that pemmican will prevent and cure scurvy. So far as I know, this is first stated explicitly in 1812, then as part of a recommendation which is looked upon as one of the causes of the Pemmican War. A. J. H. Richardson, of the staff of the National Archives of Canada in Ottawa, has examined for me some of the voluminous unpublished Selkirk documents that are in the archives, and especially the papers of William Auld, who is looked upon as being, with Miles Macdonell and others, an instigator of the Pemmican War. Richardson wrote, on April 8, 1944, quote, "I did some searching on my own in the Selkirk papers, and I'm enclosing notes on the only document that looked useful among those I had time to go through. It was written at the time of the Pemmican War, which Auld and Macdonell themselves precipitated, and you might want its evidence on the superiority of pemmican to salted meat, and indeed its absolute necessity at the posts." Unquote. Attached to Mr. Richardson's letter was the following memorandum, which is here copied exactly as written, including his footnote on Mr. Auld. Quote, "Copy of Mr. Auld's advices, May 13, 1814. He gives his reasons for advising Captain Macdonell to prevent the Northwest Company traders from carrying the so-called dried provisions out of the lands ceded to Selkirk by the Hudson's Bay Company. Among them he states that the seizure of these provisions by the Northwesters the 2 previous years had led the Hudson's Bay Company, out of anxiety to promote the welfare of the settlers, to give up part of the dried provisions collected by the company's servants, as a result of which the company are absolutely reduced to their English provisions in their stead, which it is the duty and interest of the company's principal officers to prevent, as being most injurious to the health of the people, who during the 2 preceding winters have suffered much from scurvy, a disease entirely occasioned by salted and weak food, and but too frequently especially at York Factory. The lack of dried provisions had forced the company to withdraw its servants from many posts this summer, and the Canadians, the people from the Northwest Company, will derive all the advantages of the trade in consequence of their being allowed to possess themselves of the dried provisions." End quote. The conclusions arrived at by Auld, during or before the year 1812, and apparently common among his associates, that pemmican will prevent scurvy, can be derived from the whole history of the fur trade in the interior of North America, and likewise from the history of polar exploration since the northern travelers began to use pemmican. Although the Pemmican War is considered to have started in 1814, with Macdonald's order handicapping the Northwesters in their use of pemmican, the first serious bloodshed did not take place until June 9, 1816, in a small-scale battle near Fort Douglas between the Northwesters and the Hudson's Bay Company men. In that massacre fell the representative of Lord Selkirk, Robert Semple, and with him 20 of his adherents. This was the largest single bloodletting of the war, but smaller fights occurred here and there, houses were burned, and trade goods were destroyed. How the Pemmican War looked from England while it was raging appears with a slant favorable to the Hudson's Bay Company in a privately printed and anonymous book which appeared in London during 1817, entitled Statement Respecting the Earl of Selkirk's Settlement of Kildonan, etc. I quote and paraphrase just enough to show the kind of war this was. The book is dealing with the spring of 1816 on the Quapelic River that flows eastward through southeastern Saskatchewan and southern Manitoba to the Red River. Pambrin and Sutherland of the Hudson's Bay Company faction were proceeding downstream in 5 boats with 22 men, loaded with a considerable quantity of furs and about 600 bags of pemmican, thus about 54,000 pounds. On the 12th of May they were attacked by an armed party of about 50 of the servants of the Northwest Company. Mr. Pambrin and the rest of the party were taken prisoners. The party were forcibly detained for 5 days, and then liberated under the promise not to bear arms against the Northwest Company. About the end of May, Alexander MacDonald embarked in his boats with the furs and the bags of provisions which he had seized. He was attended by a body of brûlés on horseback. Brûlés it's a French word for Native American, basically, which followed him along the bank of the river. When the party arrived near the Hudson's Bay Company trading post of Brandon House, Cuthbert Grant was dispatched with 25 men, who took the post and pillaged it, not only of all the British goods, together with the furs and provisions belonging to the company, but also of the private property of their servants. After this exploit, MacDonald divided his forces, amounting in all to about 120 men, into 4 separate brigades. When this organized garrison arrived at Portage des Prairies, the plunder was landed from the canoes, and the 600 bags of pemmican were formed into a sort of rampart, flanked by 2 brass swivels, which had formerly belonged to Lord Selkirk's settlement. On the 18th of June, Cuthbert, Grant, Fraser, Hoole, and Thomas Mackay were sent off from Portage des Prairies with about 70 men to attack the colony at Red River. On the 20th of June, a messenger returned from Cuthbert Grant, who reported that his party had killed Governor Semple with 5 of his officers and 16 of his people, upon which MacDonald, Seraphim Lamar, and all the other officers shouted with joy. End quote. The book tells the story of the Semple massacre, according to a number of eyewitnesses, each story from a written statement. About the shortest, and not the most gruesome, is from the affidavit of Michael Heeden. Quote, Boucher, the Canadian, advanced in front of his party, and, in an insolent tone, desired to know what Semple was about. Mr. Semple desired to know what he and his party wanted. Boucher said he wanted his fort. The governor desired him to go to his fort, upon which Boucher said to the governor, "Why did you destroy our fort, you damned rascal?" Mr. Semple then laid hold of the bridle of Boucher's horse, saying, "Scoundrel, do you tell me so?" Upon this Boucher jumped from his horse, and a shot was instantly fired by one of Grant's party of horsemen, which killed Mr. Holt, who was standing near Governor Semple. Boucher then ran to his party, and another shot was fired, by which Mr. Semple was wounded. The governor immediately cried out to his men, "Do what you can to take care of yourselves." But, instead of this, his party appears to have crowded about him, to ascertain what injury he had met with, and, while they were thus collected, the Brulés, who had formed a circle around them, fired a general volley among them, by which the greater part were killed or wounded. Those who were still standing took off their hats and called for mercy, but in vain. The horsemen galloped forward and butchered them. End quote. The Semple massacre was the most sensational episode of the Pemmican War. The story is told here to give an idea of the bitterness that underlay the whole struggle. For 7 years the Pemmican War was waged through a combination of gangster methods and the dirtiest business competition. The struggle ended through an amalgamation of the two companies, accomplished in London in 1821. The Northwesters had been winners in the business competition that preceded the Pemmican War, and they were to an extent victorious in the actual field struggles of that contest. But they lost out in the final settlement because of the entrenched legal position of the Hudson's Bay Company and because of the organizational weakness of a partnership as compared with a stock company. The Northwesters had built up no reserves. The partners became wealthy, each in his own right, while the corporation had little more than enough to go on from year to year. These wealthy partners were not all equally willing to put their money into a fight against the company, when it came to fire and sword. In any case, had the Northwesters been completely victorious in all respects, the company resulting from the amalgamation would probably still have been known as the Hudson's Bay, for that company owned the charter. The legal strength of the company, if combined with the adaptability of the Northwesters, could lead to success. It did. Salt meat, bread, and porridge were little used by the rejuvenated Hudson's Bay Company, except at the seaports, and at Winnipeg, where salted domestic beef and flour were locally produced. With pemmican for food and goods for trade in their canoes and on the backs of whites and Indians who carried over the portages, the servants of the great company now extended its domain along the Mackenzie to the Polar Sea and across the mountains to the Pacific, where they were stopped to the southwest by the Spaniards in California and to the northwest by the Russian-American Company in Alaska. Thus concludes Chapter 10. I hope you found that interesting. Some parts might have been a little dry, but I think overall it was a pretty interesting chapter. Maybe my least favorite so far, maybe just for all the violence. Why do you gotta fight over pemmican, you know? There's enough to go around. Anyway, next chapter is it's full of adventure. It's pretty interesting. I know I say that about every chapter, but I don't think I said it about the last chapter. Next chapter is The Romance of Pemmican, chapter 11. And it's a pretty long one. Lots of stories. Almost 30 pages, I think. It'll probably be like an hour and a half video, audio, whatever, depending on. I wonder if anyone is actually watching me read this. I don't know why you would. It's meant to be an audiobook, obviously, like, not like I'm including images or illustrating it. But I wonder if anyone out there is just watching me read. If you are, you're creepy, which is okay. It's okay to be creepy. Leave a comment if you're watching me while I read and not just listening. The reason I like audiobooks is because you can do two things at once. You can accomplish like double. You can be twice as productive. Like if you have a very simple task to do, like folding laundry, for example, or wiring electrical outlets. I used to work as an electrician, and I used to love it when I just had to wire outlets all day, because then I could put in an audiobook, and I got through so many books, and I felt like I was getting paid to read, and that's a good feeling. Anyway, hope you're enjoying the book. Let me know in the comments. All you people who are watching and not leaving comments, I'm very disappointed in you. You guys like this painting in the background, by the way? I purposely chose this this couch because it's in front of this crazy painting. It's called, I think it's called the Fairy Dirge, D-I-R-G-E. Like, I forget what that even means. I think it's like a boat. They're on a boat. They're getting married. It might even be called the Fairy Wedding. I don't know. The painter's last name is Fitzgerald, I think. It's not an original, it's a print. But it's still a really awesome... It looks like they're in the underworld, kind of. There's this... This is a lady who, for some reason, is underwater and has like a flower on her head. Like a crown with a flower. And then this guy, or these two guys, they look like... No, 3, 4... 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, they look like wizard demons. This girl is kind of creepy. There's like a bird here. There's some kind of demon up there too. I mean, I don't know if that's really the right word. Maybe they're very, very nice tree spirits or something. But anyway, I'm at my parents' house right now for the holidays, and this is my mom's. My mom is obsessed with fairies. She has like a case full of fairy figurines over there. There's a fairy right there on that table. There's a fairy on this coaster. I could go on, but you probably don't care. But well, let me at least, in case you're interested in seeing this painting closer, I'm gonna, if you're still watching, as you know, you can always just I told you it's the end of the chapter, so you don't have to be listening right now. I know you probably don't care about fairy paintings, but maybe if you care about me as a person and not just the book, or if you like art, I don't know. My point is, you could have clicked off of this video a long time ago if you wanted to, so no one's making you watch this, so you can't complain about what happens after I finish the chapter. I'm doing this for free. I'm making this audiobook for free out of my, I don't know, my love for humanity. So you get what you pay for. Or actually, you're getting a lot more than what you paid for. Oh yeah, speaking of paying, maybe I should put my Cashapp or something in the description, just in case someone wants to. I'm really not doing this for money, obviously. I think it's obvious. Maybe it's not obvious. But anyway, yeah, if you want to make a donation, if you found this book useful, even $1, $5, it's taken me like, now that I've started editing the videos, if you included the editing, then it's taken me like, it's going to take over 100 hours. The total recording time is probably like, for the whole book, is probably going to be like 40, maybe? No. An hour per chapter. Okay, maybe it's only going to be like 15 or 20, because it takes longer. Like when I record a chapter, it takes like 50% longer than the edited down, because I repeat a lot of things that don't get perfectly correct now that I'm editing. The first, you probably, if you've listened to the whole thing, you might have noticed that like the comments and the intro and the first few chapters, which I'll probably re-record and edit, or just edit the old videos so that they're perfect. I didn't realize how easy editing is. It is time consuming, but it's pretty easy. And it's nice to have like a perfect recording with just everything perfect, or much closer to perfect than my first few chapters. So, what was I trying to say? Oh, so this whole thing is going to take me, in total, probably like 100 hours. Editing, it takes like 5 hours on average, I think, to edit these videos. Because I edit out like the swallowing sounds. I edit out when I do this, like that little click. I don't think I did that so much in chapter 5, but then I started to. It's a lot of work, I don't know. But my point is, I think this audiobook, if you give me $5 for 100 hours of work, that's like 10 cents an hour for 100 hours would be $10. So it's like 5 cents an hour, I think. Anyway, yeah, maybe I should put my Cashapp or my PayPal or something. Believe it or not, this is the first time the thought has occurred to me. My main motivation behind this recording was to improve upon the only other recording. I was astounded and dismayed to discover I was happy to discover that there's already an audiobook on YouTube, but I was shocked and dismayed to discover how bad it is. No offense to anyone who helped to record that. I'm grateful. Thank you for attempting to increase the availability of this knowledge. That's great. But some of you really cannot read. Some of you have horrible voices. Some of you have very small vocabularies. Some of you live near highways, apparently, or something. So there's a lot of background noise. So that has been my main motivation, is just to improve the quality of the audiobook available to the public, because I think some people who want to listen to this book might find that audiobook and say, okay, I can't listen to this, and then maybe they'll order this edition because it's the only freaking one that I know of that's available right now. It doesn't even say the name of the publisher. StreetLib. This book was created with StreetLib Right. They took a PDF that is available for free online, which, if you're going to read this book, if you don't mind reading things on tablets or or phones or computers, whatever, then I recommend downloading the free PDF, because it will be easier to read and it will be free. And this book is basically that. They took that file and they just put it into some software and made it into a book, but it's got so many typos. So many typos, and pages missing. The last chapter, I think it was the last chapter, or maybe the one before that, there were like 2 different times where it skipped, like from one word to another word. There should have been 2 pages. So I had to go on my phone and look up that part of the book and record it, and then go back to using the book. I prefer to read it, like, it looks more old-fashioned, it looks more, traditional. I prefer the actual book, but sometimes it's nice to just have, like, I have like 100 books on my phone. We live in such a miraculous time. Also such a terrifying, horrible time. But there are lots of pros and cons of living these days. Man, I have been rambling almost as long as I was reading the chapter, I think. I wonder if anyone is still listening. Who am I talking to? I'm so curious who's on the other side of the screen. I mean, right now I'm not talking to anybody because I'm recording. Who will this be talking to? Who will I be talking to? Who will be listening to me? Do you believe in fairies? Do you think fairies are real? There's another really good book. Maybe I should read that one next. It's really long though. Anyway, the book I'm talking about is called The Fairy Faith and Celtic Countries. It's pretty good. And it really convinced me that there is like a fairy dimension. Maybe the spirit world, or maybe there's like several spirit worlds or dimensions. But one of them is filled with fairies, and they're not all tiny. Some of them are like human-sized or bigger. I've never seen any, personally. But I believe the stories, because there's too much commonality between people who've never met. And a lot of the people are like just super sane, super like they're like doctors and lawyers and business executives and people who have nothing to gain and everything to lose by saying, hey, I saw a fairy, you know, but they do it anyway because it's the truth. But I wonder what it is about the Celtic countries. Why do people see fairies in Ireland and Scotland and Wales and Cornwall, the UK, not elsewhere? I really want to make some pemmican. Alright, I think that's it. I think I'm done rambling. I really didn't think I was going to say anything at the end of this chapter. Because I didn't have anything to say about the chapter itself. Except like, I really wish they didn't have to fight about the pemmican. I wish no one had to die over it. But shit happens. Alright, thanks for listening. Let me know what you think in the comments. Catch you on the next chapter. Peace.